Robert Mason had lived in solitude for years, his cabin tucked deep within the Montana wilderness. He had come to accept the rhythms of nature, the brutal winters, the endless silence, and the company of his aging Labrador. Mac's life was predictable, unchanging. That was until the morning he saw them. Through the frost-covered window, Robert spotted an enormous figure, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but as he stepped closer, his heart clenched. A mother bear stood motionless in the clearing, her thick fur coated in ice, her breath slow and labored. Beside her, two small cubs huddled close, their tiny frames trembling against the unrelenting wind. They were weak, too weak to move. Robert knew the dangers of the wild. A starving bear, especially a mother with cubs, could be unpredictable, even deadly. His instincts told him to stay inside, to let nature take its course. But another part of him, the part that had lost too much in this life, the part that still ached from loneliness, refused to turn away. Robert grabbed his binoculars, scanning the scene with growing concern. The mother wasn't just cold, she was exhausted. The cubs were barely clinging to life. He could see it in the way they staggered, their tiny legs sinking into the deep snow, their breath coming in uneven gasps. If he did nothing, they wouldn't survive the night. Swallowing his hesitation, he pulled on his thickest coat, boots, and gloves. He grabbed a bundle of jerky and some bread, stuffing them into his pockets before stepping out into the storm. The wind howled around him, stinging his skin as he moved toward the clearing. The mother bear let out a deep, guttural growl, her body stiffening as he approached. Robert stopped a few feet away, raising his hands slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you," he murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. The bear's dark eyes locked onto his for a long moment. Neither moved. Then, as if understanding the desperation of her situation, the bear lowered her head. Robert reached into his pocket, pulling out a piece of jerky. He crouched and placed it in the snow, then took a slow step back. The bear hesitated, sniffing the air. Hunger won over fear. She took an unsteady step forward, grabbed the food, and swallowed it whole. It was a start. Robert retreated to the barn, moving quickly. He piled hay in the corner, laid out old blankets, and plugged in a portable heater. It wasn't much, but it was warmer than the frozen wilderness outside. Back in the clearing, he laid a trail of food leading to the barn, then stepped back and waited. The mother bear sniffed the ground, her instincts battling her fear. She nudged one of the cubs forward, then the other. Slowly, painfully, they followed the trail, step by step, moving toward safety. By the time Robert returned to the cabin, the mother and her cubs had settled inside the barn. He watched from the window, his breath fogging up the glass. Then something happened that sent a shiver down his spine. The mother bear lifted her head and looked straight at him. There was no aggression in her gaze, only understanding. Gratitude. The next morning, Robert went to check on them. The bear didn't move as he entered, her cubs curled beside her. He worked quietly, setting down a bowl of water and more food before stepping back. He didn't expect her to trust him. But then she did something remarkable. She nudged the food toward her cubs first, letting them eat before she took a bite herself. Then, she turned her massive head toward Robert and exhaled a slow, heavy breath. It was a gesture not of fear, but of recognition. Robert felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. His solitude had been broken, not by people, but by a mother fighting to save her young. Over the next few days, he and the bear developed a silent understanding. He brought food, kept the heater running, and checked in from a safe distance. And each time, she watched him with those deep, knowing eyes. Even Max, his old Labrador, seemed to sense the importance of what was happening. He would sit outside the barn, tail wagging gently, as if offering his own quiet support. As the days passed, the storm subsided. The mother bear grew stronger, her cubs more playful. It became clear they wouldn't need Robert's help much longer. One morning, he stepped outside to find them standing near the tree line. The mother bear turned her head, meeting his gaze one last time. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she dipped her head, a silent farewell. Robert watched as she led her cubs into the woods, their forms disappearing into the evergreens. He stood there long after they were gone, the wind cold against his face. For years, he had believed he was alone. But now, he understood something profound. Compassion wasn't just about saving others. Sometimes, in giving kindness, we save ourselves. Robert's decision to open his door that night wasn't just about helping a bear. It was about breaking the barriers between man and nature, between solitude and connection. His story reminds us all that kindness is never wasted. Even when it seems small. Even when it goes unspoken. Because sometimes, the greatest bonds form in the most unexpected ways. Because sometimes the greatest bonds form in the most unexpected ways. This time was different. There was no tension in her stance, no wary glances toward the man or Max. Instead, she exhaled a deep, steady breath and settled herself down beside them, her massive body curving protectively around the group. It was a silent acknowledgement. She had accepted them. Robert Mason stood in the doorway of the barn, watching in quiet amazement. This wasn't just survival anymore, this was something more. The mother bear, the cubs, his loyal dog Max, they had found comfort in each other in a way that defied instinct and reason. And Robert, a man who had spent so much of his life alone, realized that he had, too. Over the next few days, the storm raged on, but inside the barn, warmth persisted, not just from the heater Robert had set up, but from the companionship that had formed. He made sure to bring extra food, careful to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. The mother bear no longer growled when he approached. Instead, she simply watched him with those deep, knowing eyes. One evening, as Robert placed a fresh bucket of water near the hay pile, something happened that sent a shiver, not of fear but of awe, down his spine. The mother bear, who had kept her distance for so long, took a step toward him. Slowly, cautiously, she sniffed the air, her dark eyes locked onto his. And then, in a moment Robert would never forget, she let out a soft, rumbling huff. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a growl. It was something else, something that felt like gratitude. The days passed, and as the storm subsided, Robert knew what had to come next. The mother bear and her cubs couldn't stay, for they belonged in the wild. And even though the thought of letting them go weighed heavy on his heart, he and Max spent the following days preparing. He reinforced the barn's doors, ensuring the bears had enough food and water to regain their full strength before heading back into the wilderness. The mother bear seemed to understand what was happening. She no longer lingered as long after eating, and her eyes often drifted toward the tree line. Then, on one fateful morning, Robert stood by the barn as she met his gaze one last time. And then, with slow, deliberate grace, she lifted her massive paw and made a motion that could only be described as a wave. "Goodbye, old girl," Robert murmured. "Take care." That night, the cabin felt cold. In the end, it wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about a bear and her cubs finding shelter in a barn during a blizzard. It was about something much deeper: trust, understanding, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the most unlikely connections can leave the deepest impact. As Robert drifted off to sleep that night, he realized something. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. He felt whole. The bear family, the mother bear, let out a low, warning growl, her muscles tensed, her protective instincts fully awakened. The cubs whimpered, pressing against her thick fur, sensing her unease. Robert Mason stood still, his breath visible in the cold air, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Then, the sound came again, branches snapping under the weight of something large. The tension in the barn was suffocating, every creature inside holding their breath. Max let out a soft but firm bark, his tail raised high in alertness. Robert's fingers tightened around the flashlight in his hand. He knew better than to go charging into the woods blindly. Whatever was out there, another bear, a moose, or maybe even a lone wolf, was close. Too close. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the noise stopped. The forest fell into silence once more, only the distant howl of the wind remaining, whistling through the trees like a ghostly whisper. The mother bear slowly lowered her head, her ears twitching as she listened. Robert exhaled cautiously. Whatever it was, it had moved on, for now. Max relaxed first, giving a shake of his fur before stepping back toward the cubs. The mother bear remained still for a few moments longer before nudging her cubs closer, as if reassuring them. Robert took this as his cue to move back as well, giving them space. The night continued uneventfully, but something had shifted. Over the next few days, the mother bear grew more restless. She would sit near the barn entrance, staring into the woods for long periods, her deep, thoughtful eyes scanning the endless stretch of trees. The cubs, sensing her mood, began to wander toward the doorway more frequently. Robert had seen this before. He knew what it meant. The mother bear was preparing to leave. Though she had found shelter here, though she had trusted him and Max in ways he never thought possible, she was still a wild creature. The pull of the forest was calling her home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Robert made his decision. He would let them go. Early the next morning, Robert opened the barn doors wide, the cool winter air sweeping inside. The mother bear stood at the threshold, staring out at the vast expanse of white that stretched before them. The cubs hesitated at her feet, unsure. Robert stood a few steps away, watching in silence. Max, ever the loyal companion, sat by his side, his eyes locked on the family he had come to love. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, the mother bear took a step forward. The cubs looked back at Robert, then at Max. For a moment, it seemed like they might stay, but instinct was stronger. One by one, they followed their mother into the snow, their tiny paws leaving delicate prints behind them. Robert felt an ache in his chest as he watched them go, disappearing between the towering trees, but he knew it was right. This was where they belonged. Then, just before they vanished completely, the mother bear stopped. She turned her massive head, looking back at Robert one last time. Their eyes met, and for a brief, fleeting moment, something unspoken passed between them, a silent farewell, a thank you. Then she was gone. The barn felt emptier that night, the quiet settling in like a soft, familiar weight. Robert sat by the fire, Max curled up beside him, staring into the flickering flames. He had lived a lifetime in solitude, content in his own company, but these past weeks had changed something deep within him. The bond he had formed with the bears, with Max, had reminded him of something he had long forgotten. The world was not meant to be lived alone. In the days that followed, Robert found himself stepping outside more often, listening for distant sounds in the trees. Part of him hoped, just once, that he might hear the familiar huff of a bear somewhere beyond the tree line. But even if he never saw them again, he knew one thing for certain: their story wasn't just about survival. It was about trust, about kindness, about the unbreakable connection between man and nature. And in that, Robert Mason had found something he never realized he was missing: a purpose. The air crackled with tension, the quiet before the inevitable clash of survival instincts. Robert Mason's grip on the wooden post beside him tightened, his breath coming slow and steady. He'd seen enough wildlife encounters to know how dangerous this moment was. Max remained at his side, his muscles taut with anticipation, his fur bristling as he watched the enormous bear approach. The mother bear stood firm, placing herself between her cubs and the looming threat, her growls growing deeper, more guttural. She was ready to fight for them, ready to defend them at any cost. Robert knew that if it came to a full-on confrontation, the mother bear stood little chance against the much larger male. He needed to act before it was too late. Without thinking, Robert reached down, grabbing the metal bucket he had used to carry food scraps to the barn. He banged it hard against the wooden post, the metallic clang slicing through the frigid air. Max barked sharply in response, adding to the sudden disruption. The large male bear hesitated, shifting its weight, surprised by the unexpected noise. Robert took a deep breath and stepped forward, keeping himself just close enough to be seen but not close enough to be perceived as a direct threat. He banged the bucket again, his voice firm but steady. "Go on now," he called out, his voice carrying over the clearing. "You're not welcome here." Max barked again, his tail stiff, standing his ground beside Robert. The mother bear, sensing an opportunity, let out a forceful roar, baring her teeth and standing her ground with even more authority. The massive male hesitated once more, its small, dark eyes flicking between the human, the dog, and the defiant mother bear. Then, slowly, it began to back away. Robert held his breath as the bear took another step back, then another. Finally, with one last lingering glance, the beast turned and lumbered away, vanishing into the thick forest. The mother bear remained still for several long moments, her breathing heavy, her body still rigid with tension. Only when she was certain the threat had passed did she turn, nudging her cubs toward the barn once more. Robert let out a shaky breath, rubbing his hands together to dispel the tension in his limbs. He turned to Max, who still stood alert, his tail finally beginning to lower. "Good boy," Robert murmured, scratching the dog behind the ears. That night, the barn was quieter than usual, the cubs, exhausted from the ordeal, curled together in a warm pile of fur. The mother bear lay beside them, her breathing steady, her watchful eyes softer than before. Robert stood at the entrance of the barn, leaning against the frame, watching over them. Max sat beside him, his head resting on Robert's knee, both of them keeping silent vigil over their unlikely companions. In that moment, Robert realized something profound. He had stepped in to help these bears out of sheer instinct, an act of kindness and compassion that he hadn't questioned. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. They weren't just wild animals seeking shelter anymore. They had become something more, a family. A bond had formed, one that defied logic and nature's rule. And even though the day would come when the mother bear and her cubs would return to the wild, Robert knew this connection would stay with him forever. As he stood there, the cold wind whispering through the trees outside, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. Not just from the quiet night or the safety they had secured, but from the simple, unshakable truth that in the harshest conditions, kindness could bridge even the widest gaps. And sometimes, the greatest family was the one you never expected to find. The tension between them thickened, the crisp mountain air charged with unspoken challenge. For a fleeting second, Robert Mason locked eyes with the mother bear. It was a glance most would have dismissed, but to him, it was everything. It was an unspoken plea, a silent cry for help, not just for her cubs, but for herself. She wasn't just protecting them. She was trusting him to stand by their side, just as he had since that fateful night when he first opened his door. He felt the weight of that trust settle deep in his chest. This wasn't just another confrontation between wild creatures, it was a test. A test of everything they had built together: trust, resilience, and the fragile but powerful bond that now held them together. With a deep breath, Robert took a slow, deliberate step forward. His voice, calm and steady, cut through the frozen air. "Go on," he murmured, his breath forming soft clouds in the cold. "This is our home." Max, standing at his side, barked sharply, a bold, unwavering sound that echoed through the clearing. The man placed a reassuring hand on his back, as if to say, "Together, we can face this." The large, imposing bear looming before them hesitated. It huffed, eyes flickering between Robert, Max, and the mother bear, who had planted herself firmly between her cubs and the threat. Then, with a final, grudging growl, the intruder turned. Slowly, deliberately, it lumbered back into the dense forest, swallowed by the towering pines. Robert exhaled, the tension melting away like the last remnants of frost under the morning sun. The mother bear let out a slow, deep breath, her muscles visibly relaxing. She nudged her cubs closer, ensuring they were safe, then turned her gaze to Max. Her massive head tilted slightly, and for the first time, there was something softer in her expression, something that almost looked like gratitude. Max, sensing the shift, wagged his tail and gave a small, reassuring bark. The cubs, still trembling, huddled close to his side, pressing their tiny bodies into his warmth. Robert watched, his heart pounding with something deeper than relief. They weren't just animals surviving together anymore. They were family. As winter loosened its grip, the once barren land gave way to hints of spring. The snow, which had blanketed everything in cold silence, began to recede. Small buds appeared on the branches, and the crisp air carried the fresh scent of new life. The barn, once just a shelter from the storm, had become something much greater. It was a sanctuary, not just for the bears, but for all of them. The cubs, once weak and frail, grew stronger with each passing day. They chased each other through the fields, their playful squeals echoing through the valley. They wrestled with Max, tumbling through the grass as he patiently let them climb over him. And the mother bear, she had changed, too. No longer stiff with fear, no longer bound by the instinct to flee or fight, she had grown into something even more powerful, a protector in her own right. She trusted Robert now. That trust had not come easily, nor had it been demanded. It had been earned, through patience, through quiet moments, through the simple, unwavering presence of someone who had refused to walk away. Max, once just a ranch dog, had become more than a companion. He was their guide, their teacher. The bond he had formed with the cubs went beyond instinct. It was understanding, a quiet promise that they were safe with him. And Robert, he had changed most of all. The loneliness that had once settled deep in his bones had been replaced by something he hadn't realized he was missing. Purpose. Connection. The kind of love that wasn't spoken but felt in the quiet moments when the world slowed down and all that remained was the unbreakable bond between man and beast. One evening, as the golden light of sunset stretched across the valley, Robert sat on his porch, Max curled up at his feet. The cubs, exhausted from a long day of exploring, were nestled in the barn's hay, their soft breathing blending with the sounds of the night. The mother bear stood at the edge of the clearing, gazing toward the trees, her eyes thoughtful, distant. Robert knew it was time. Spring was calling her back to the wild, and she was ready. The cubs, still young, still learning, would need her guidance in ways he and Max could not provide. They had grown, but they were not yet fully prepared for the life that awaited them beyond the safety of the barn. She turned her head, looking at Robert one last time. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. She stepped forward, brushing her nose gently against Max's head. He wagged his tail, nuzzling her in return, as if saying goodbye in his own way. Then, she turned, nudging her cubs awake. One by one, they stretched, yawned, then followed her as she led them toward the tree line. Robert watched as they disappeared into the forest. The last rays of sunlight cast long shadows behind them. His chest felt tight, but not with sadness. This wasn't an end, it was a new beginning. Max whined softly beside him, watching the place where their friends had vanished. Robert scratched behind his ears, his voice quiet but firm. "They'll be okay, boy." And deep down, he knew it was true. They had faced the worst together. They had built something unbreakable. And though the wild had called them home, the memories, the bond, would never fade. As the stars blinked to life above the darkened forest, Robert let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep within him. This land had always been his home, but now, for the first time in a long time, it truly felt like one. The story of Robert Mason, the mother bear, and her cubs is more than just a tale of survival. It is a powerful reflection of the values that shape our everyday lives. At its core, this story speaks to themes of compassion, trust, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that can form in the most unexpected circumstances. In many ways, Robert's decision to open his door to the bear family mirrors the choices we face in life, whether to turn away from challenges or to embrace them with courage and kindness. In today's fast-paced world, it is easy to overlook the struggles of others. Just as Robert could have ignored the bear's suffering, we often walk past people in need, assuming that someone else will step in. But his story teaches us that a single act of kindness, no matter how small, can change lives. Whether it is offering a helping hand to a neighbor, comforting a friend going through a tough time, or even extending kindness to a stranger, the impact of compassion cannot be underestimated. Robert didn't know what would happen when he decided to help the bears, just as we never truly know the ripples our actions can create. Yet his willingness to step up set off a chain of events that fostered trust, built relationships, and ultimately saved lives. Another vital lesson from Robert's experience is the power of trust. The bond that formed between him, the bears, and his loyal dog, Max, wasn't built overnight. It took patience, consistency, and a willingness to respect boundaries. In our personal relationships, trust is equally important. Whether in friendships, family connections, or professional partnerships, trust is not something that can be demanded. It must be earned through actions, not words. Just as the mother bear initially approached with hesitation but gradually allowed Robert into her world, we must understand that trust is a fragile yet powerful force that requires time and sincerity to develop. The story also highlights the strength that comes from facing challenges together. The mother bear, despite her instincts to survive alone, found safety and support in Robert and Max. In life, we often try to handle struggles on our own, believing that vulnerability is a weakness. But true strength comes from knowing when to accept help. Whether it's leaning on family, seeking advice from mentors, or finding comfort in friends, we must remember that we don't have to navigate life's difficulties alone. Just as the bear family found unity in their shared struggle, we too can find strength in our communities. Perhaps the most profound message from this story is about letting go. Robert spent months caring for the bears, forming an undeniable bond with them. But when the time came for them to return to the wild, he had to accept that their journey was meant to continue without him. This is a lesson we all face in different ways, whether it's watching children grow up and leave home, saying goodbye to loved ones, or letting go of past regrets. Life is a constant cycle of holding on and letting go, and true love means knowing when to release what we cherish most, trusting that it will thrive on its own. In the end, Robert's experience is a testament to the deep connections we share, not just with people, but with the world around us. It reminds us to act with kindness, to trust in the bonds we build, to face struggles together, and to embrace life's inevitable changes with an open heart. Just like Robert stood on his porch, watching the bear family disappear into the wilderness, we too must learn that some stories don't end, they simply take a different path. And if we've lived with kindness, love, and courage, then that is more than enough. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of life. See you in the next story.